Her name was Dr. Elena Vasquez, glaciologist, University of Oslo. She spent 11 years studying ice core data from the Antarctic interior. Not the politics, not the history, just the ice. That was the job. Measure, record, publish, go home. She told me that she never meant to become the kind of person who chases footnotes down rabbit holes at 2 in the morning. She had a grant. She had a team. She had a daughter starting secondary school back in Madrid. She was not, she said, the conspiracy type. And then, in the spring of 2019, she read a footnote. 1840. That's the number I want you to hold in your mind. Not a range, not an era. A single year. 3 expeditions, American, British, French, each independently sailed to the same frozen continent within months of one another. I accepted that for years. Parallel exploration, the age of discovery. It makes sense on the surface. Then Elena found the same thing I eventually found. A single line buried in a footnote of Wilkes's suppressed expedition log. A line that his superiors redacted from the published version. 7 words. Formations inconsistent with any natural process known. I almost didn't catch it. It was a microfilm archive physical microfilm, the kind you have to scroll through manually. The footnote was in a supplementary appendix that wasn't digitized. I was looking for something else entirely. Ice density figures from the 1840s for comparative modeling. And there it was. 7 words that didn't belong. I wrote it down. I closed the archive. I went home. I made dinner for my daughter. And at 2 in the morning, I was back at my laptop, and I couldn't explain why. 50 years after that footnote was written, a survivor of the first expedition to overwinter on Antarctica gave a single interview describing his crew seeing cities beneath the ice. That section wasn't translated into English for 60 years. That's when Elena stopped being able to look away. That's when I stopped, too. Let's establish what the textbooks tell us. What the official record, such as it is, allows. Charles Wilkes, American naval officer. He departed in August 1838, leading 6 vessels. He charted over 1,500 miles of Antarctic coastline and returned in 1842. His report, the one he filed, was disputed almost immediately. Not disputed for being too bold, disputed for being incomplete. His charts contained features, formations. His officers noted discrepancies between what the official log recorded and what crew members described in private correspondence later recovered by researchers. Wilkes faced court-martial upon his return. Not once, multiple times over the course of his career. Accused of illegal punishment of crew, of conduct unbecoming. He was acquitted on most charges. But he spent the next several decades of his life buried in bureaucratic obscurity, his Antarctic findings overshadowed, his personal journals heavily edited before publication. I pulled the court-martial transcripts, the publicly available ones at least. And what strikes you, what you don't read about in the standard biography, is not what Wilkes was accused of. It's what the accusers never mentioned. In 40 pages of testimony, not one word about what his expedition actually found. Not one question about the coastline, the formations, the charts his officers disputed. That absence is its own kind of answer. Dumont d'Urville departed Toulon in September 1837. His mission was to push further south than any French vessel had gone, to claim territory, to advance science, to plant the tricolor in ice. He returned in November 1840. He published his accounts. Adélie Land, named for his wife, was charted. He is remembered. He is celebrated. In May 1842, he boarded a train at Versailles with his wife and son. The train derailed. The fire that followed was catastrophic. D'Urville, his wife, his son did not survive. Much of the material he'd been traveling with, including expedition documents he was reportedly transporting for review, gone. Not lost at sea, not destroyed in a naval warehouse fire. On a train in France, 2 years after returning from Antarctica. I'm not saying that means anything. I want to be precise about that. Train accidents happen. Tragedy is not conspiracy. But I ask you to hold that detail. Just hold it. And James Clark Ross, the most decorated of the three. He reached what would be named the Ross Ice Shelf, a wall of ice the height of the White Cliffs of Dover, stretching for hundreds of miles. He described it as impenetrable, as staggering, as something that stopped him absolutely. His published accounts are considered models of Victorian scientific restraint, precise, methodical, dispassionate. And yet his crew logs the raw ones filed with the Admiralty, the ones that took researchers decades to fully access contained passages that don't appear anywhere in the official narrative. References to what one officer described only as geometric anomalies in the exposed rock faces. References, in at least 2 independent crew journals, to what sounds like structured stone. Not ice. Stone. 3 nations. Actively competing nations. All 3 return from the same continent in the same decade, and all 3 independently, with no mechanism for coordination produce official records that are incomplete in the exact same way. Not the temperature readings, not the biological specimens, not the navigational data. The rocks. Whatever they saw in the rock is what they were told not to say. If you follow the thread further and once you start, it becomes genuinely difficult to stop you arrive at Karsten Borchgrevink, Norwegian-British explorer, part of a whaling expedition in 1895 that became, by most accounts, the first group to actually land on the Antarctic continent. Not chart it from offshore, not approach and retreat. Land. Stand on it. Walk. He returned in 1898 with a dedicated scientific expedition, the Southern Cross Expedition, and spent the winter of 1899 on the continent. The first humans to deliberately overwinter in Antarctica. What did he find? Here is where the official record does something I've come to recognize. It narrows. It becomes very specific about certain things, the cold, the isolation, the biological samples, the meteorological measurements, and very vague, almost deliberately vague, about others. One of his crew, a zoologist named Nikolai Hansen, died during the expedition. Official cause? A digestive condition. He was 29 years old. He was buried on a ridge overlooking the bay. His death receives 1 paragraph in most historical accounts. Another crew member returned from the expedition and spent the rest of his life declining to speak publicly about what he'd experienced. He gave one interview, one to a Norwegian newspaper in 1903. The relevant section was not translated into English for nearly 60 years. When it finally was, it described crew members experiencing what the interviewer gently called episodes of geographic fixation. That is, crew members who became convinced they could see something beneath the ice, something organized, something that shouldn't be there. I tracked down the translated interview through a contact at the University of Tromsø. The original Norwegian isn't even that hard to find. It's in a regional archive, properly cataloged. The 60-year gap in translation isn't because no one could. It's because, as near as I can tell, no one tried. Or at least, no one with the institutional backing to publish what they found. The phrase in Norwegian that gets translated as geographic fixation is more literal than that. It's closer to the convinced seeing. The crew members weren't disoriented. They were certain. They weren't hallucinating random shapes. They described specific things, repeatedly, to each other and eventually to the interviewer. The word one of them used for what he saw, the Norwegian word, is the same word used in architecture. Not geology. Architecture. The deeper you go into Borchgrevink's own writings, the more you notice a particular pattern. He is precise about logistics. He is detailed about wildlife. He becomes strangely abstract, almost poetic, almost evasive when describing the interior geology. When describing what the rock looked like where the wind had scoured the ice away. When describing what the formations reminded him of, he never finishes those sentences. Not metaphorically. Literally. In at least 3 known passages from his private correspondence, the sentence describing the rock formations is cut short, transitions abruptly, or exists in a version that differs markedly from the version filed with his expedition sponsors. Let's talk about what the physical record actually suggests. Antarctica is not uniformly covered in ice. There are exposed rock regions, nunataks, they're called, where geology is accessible, where you can examine the actual surface of the continent. Early expedition members described, repeatedly, formations in these exposed zones that struck them as anomalous. The language varies. Peculiar regularity, unusual right-angle faces, stone arrangements unlike natural weathering patterns. But the theme repeats with an unsettling precision across multiple independent accounts from multiple expeditions spanning several decades. Regular angles, repeated geometric intervals, stone that, in the words of one crew member whose journal was published privately by his family in 1931, and has never been incorporated into mainstream historical literature, stone that did not break the way stone breaks. Geologists will tell you about columnar basalt. They'll explain frost wedging, differential erosion, the natural tendency of certain volcanic rock to cleave in angular patterns. I know that. I've read those explanations. And those explanations account for a great deal of what early explorers may have found disorienting in an environment unlike anything they'd ever seen. But here is where the orthodox explanation becomes harder to sustain. It's not the angles, it's the distribution. Multiple crew members from multiple expeditions, men who had never met, who in some cases were citizens of actively competing nations, who had no mechanism for coordinating their accounts, described similar formations in different geographic locations along the Antarctic coast. Not the same location. Different locations. Separated by hundreds of miles. I mapped them. That's what I do. I map things. I took every primary source account I could locate, cross-referenced the approximate coordinates described, and plotted them. And I want to be careful about how I say this, because I am a scientist, and I know what I can and cannot claim from the data. What I can say is this. The distribution of described anomalies does not cluster the way natural geological features cluster. It's not random either. There is a spacing pattern. Consistent intervals, roughly, with some variation. I showed the map to a colleague, a geomorphologist I trust, without telling her what she was looking at. She studied it for a while. Then she said, "This looks deliberate." I said, "I know. If you overlay the approximate locations described in these various accounts, a pattern emerges that doesn't map neatly onto known geological formations. The descriptions cluster in ways that suggest, and I want to use the word suggest, distribution. Intentional placement. Spacing. Not a quarry, not a single building. Something larger. Something that would require you to step back very far back to perceive as a whole. For the official history to hold for the natural geology plus overexcited explorers explanation to fully account for what we find in these records, you need to explain something. You need to explain why three separate governments in the same decade, with no coordinated communication, all chose to heavily redact, delay, dispute, or simply never fully publish the raw reports from their Antarctic expeditions. The United States did not publish Wilkes's complete charts for years. Some were reclassified. The British Admiralty received Ross's full logs, and a substantial portion of what his officers separately filed was not publicly catalogued until the 20th century. France published d'Urville's account, but the account itself has been noted by at least two French historians as diverging from surviving crew diaries in specific recurring ways. Always the same kinds of divergence. The geological observations, the descriptions of the coastline's interior features, the character of what the exposed rock looked like. Not the temperature readings, not the biological specimens, not the navigational data. The rocks. Why the rocks? 3 nations, no shared communication, all suppressing the same category of information. The official explanation doesn't just strain here, it collapses. Because for this to be coincidence, you'd need to believe that 3 separate governments operating in competitive isolation all independently decided that the geological features of Antarctica were too sensitive to publish accurately for reasons none of them ever formally articulated within the same 20-year window. Or something else? Something they all saw or were told about that required the same response. Here's the thing I keep coming back to, as a scientist. In my field, when three independent research teams produce data with the same systematic gap, the same category of measurement conspicuously absent from all three datasets, we don't call that a coincidence. We call that a signal. The absence is the data. The silence is the finding. There is a body of research, not fringe research, not anonymous internet speculation, but work by architectural historians, geographers, and scholars of cartographic anomalies that has been quietly building a case for the existence of a prior civilization whose reach was substantially broader and whose erasure was substantially more deliberate than mainstream history acknowledges. You will have encountered this material under various names. The maps produced before formal exploration, the Peary Race map, the Orontius Phineas map, which appeared to depict Antarctic coastlines with a specificity that shouldn't have been possible. Coastlines that match topography only confirmed by 20th century sonar. Coastlines depicted without the ice that now covers them. How? The standard answer that these maps were copied from older sources, possibly compiled from explorers whose records are now lost, is itself an admission. It admits that cartographic knowledge of Antarctica existed before the expeditions we recognize as first contact. It admits that someone had been there, had mapped it, had left records detailed enough that European cartographers in the 16th century could reproduce them with recognizable accuracy. It just doesn't ask who. I've spent time with the Orontius Phineas map specifically, the Antarctic coastline it depicts, and I'm speaking now purely as someone who works with Antarctic geography, is not a guess. It's not a vague approximation. The proportional relationships between coastal features, the curvature of the landmass, the approximate positioning of major geographical zones, it matches the sub-ice topography we confirmed with ground-penetrating radar in the 20th century. That map was made in 1531. Ground-penetrating radar was invented in the 1970s. I'm not telling you what to conclude from that. I'm telling you that I cannot explain it. And I've tried. I want to return to the human element for a moment, because this isn't just an archival mystery. It's a story about what these expeditions did to the men on them. The rate of psychological distress among early Antarctic expedition crew is not something widely discussed in mainstream historical literature. But it's documented. Multiple crew members from the Wilkes expedition were described in ship records as suffering from what the surgeons of the day called polar madness, a broad diagnosis that covered everything from simple cabin fever to episodes of acute hallucinatory crisis. Some of these men described visions, cities, architecture in the ice. I know what the rational response to that is: isolation, hypoxia, the psychological strain of extreme environment. The visual distortions caused by Antarctic light phenomena fata morgana, the mirage effect that polar explorers are well documented to have experienced, in which distant ice can appear to take on the shapes of towers, walls, buildings. All of that is real. All of that is documented. I'm not dismissing it. But here is what I keep returning to. The visions these crew members reported were not random. They were not generic castles or European cityscapes transposed onto the ice. The architectural descriptions that survived in private letters, in unpublished journals, in the one or two accounts that made it into print before being quietly discontinued, those descriptions have a specific character. Massive scale, non-European proportion, stone rather than timber or brick, layouts suggesting not individual buildings but planned arrangements, districts, grids. And they described it as buried, visible only in fragments, as if whatever they were seeing, whether by mirage or hallucination or something else entirely, was the exposed corner of something incomprehensibly larger, still concealed beneath the ice. One officer, I'll decline to name him because his family is still identifiable, wrote in a letter to his brother that he had seen, from the ship's deck, a sequence of walls extending along the cliff face for a distance I cannot estimate, and bearing no resemblance to any formation I was able to attribute to nature or weather. He reported it to his commanding officer. He was told to strike it from his personal log. He did not strike it from the letter. The letter was donated to a regional archive by his descendants in 1974. It has been cited in exactly one academic paper. That paper was never republished after its initial appearance in a specialist journal that folded 2 years later. I found that paper. It took me 4 months. A physical copy exists in one library in Edinburgh. I flew there to read it. And I want to tell you something about the experience of sitting in that reading room, with that letter's description reproduced in footnote 12, knowing that almost no one alive has read those words. It doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like responsibility. Like you've been handed something that was very carefully put away and you have to decide what to do with it. Here is where I have to be honest about the limits of what I can demonstrate versus what I can only gesture toward. If there existed, at some point prior to recorded history, or prior to the history we're permitted to access, a civilization operating at a scale capable of worldwide presence, capable of construction in extreme environments, capable of leaving traces in the rock that would still be visible to 19th century naval officers even through accumulated centuries of ice and weathering, then the question isn't whether Antarctica was inhabited. The question is when it stopped being inhabited. And the question after that is why the record of its habitation was so thoroughly, so consistently erased. Not suppressed in one country, not buried by one government. Erased across languages, across archives, across the official histories of nations that have spent centuries in competition with each other and yet somehow arrived at the same silence on this single subject. That uniformity of silence is itself a form of evidence. My daughter asked me once when she was about 12, why people lie. And I gave her the standard answers: fear, self-interest, protection. But she pushed back. She said, "But what about when everyone lies about the same thing? That's not lying anymore. That's agreement." I think about that a lot now. The silence around Antarctica isn't a lie exactly. It's an agreement. One that no one signed. One that no single person decided. One that generated itself, the way certain truths, if they are large enough and disruptive enough, generate their own institutional gravity toward erasure. What strikes me, the longer I sit with this material, isn't the individual anomalies. Any single one of these could be explained. Any individual discrepancy, any single redaction, any one explorer's breakdown or unexplained death or cryptic letter taken alone, each of these is manageable. Historical noise. It's the pattern, not the geology alone, not the simultaneous expeditions alone, not the suppressed reports alone, not the deaths alone, not the raving crew members alone, not the pre-ice maps alone. All of it together pointing in the same direction, across a century of Antarctic engagement, across governments that despised each other, across languages and archives and institutional interests that had every reason to compete and no apparent reason to converge and yet converging. On a single uniform absence, 3 expeditions, 1 silence. What did they find on that coastline that required 3 competing nations to independently arrive at the same omission? What did the rock look like in those scoured margins where the wind had pulled the ice away that made experienced naval officers reach for language they couldn't quite complete? Why do the pre-discovery maps know what they shouldn't know? Why do the men who saw it most closely come back change some of them broken, some of them silent, some of them dead before they could be properly questioned? What is the relationship between those geometric distributions and the ones researchers have been documenting quietly in dozens of other locations across the Earth? The architectural uniformities, the impossible coordination, the civilization-scale evidence that appears wherever someone looks carefully enough and is willing to write down what they actually see, rather than what they've been told to see? Elena Vasquez went back to Oslo. She published her ice core research. She got her grant renewed. She attended her daughter's graduation. And on a Tuesday evening in November 2022, she submitted a paper not to a glaciology journal, to an interdisciplinary archive, a small one, not well read. It documented the geographic distribution of anomalous formation descriptions from 19th century Antarctic expedition records, cross-referenced against known geological surveys. The paper received 2 peer reviews. One reviewer requested minor revisions. One reviewer withdrew from the process without explanation. It was accepted. It was published. It has been downloaded, as of the last time she checked, 112 times. She told me she checks the download count every few weeks. Not out of vanity, out of something she couldn't quite name. Hoping, maybe, that whoever is on the other end of those 112 downloads is asking the same questions she is. Hoping they're not asking them alone. I don't know what lies beneath that ice. I genuinely don't know, and I want to be careful not to claim more than the evidence supports. But I know what the evidence suggests. I know what it feels like to read these accounts in sequence, to watch the same absence repeat itself across decades, across languages, across the institutional memories of governments that should have no reason to agree on anything. It feels like a door that someone very carefully closed. And somewhere on the other side of it, under ice that has been thickening for centuries, over stone that may or may not have been shaped by hands we have no name for, the answer is still there, waiting for whoever is willing to ask the question loudly enough.